I want to welcome everybody to what is now the second in our series of webinars that are investigating issues around racial diversity and the nonprofit sector. And today's webinar is going to focus on board diversity and the challenges of board diversity. And not only are we going to talk about the issues around it, but we're also going to try to offer some solutions. So I want to take a moment actually to introduce our moderator, Lisa Tabor. Lisa Tabor is the owner and chief executive of Culture Brokers based here in St. Paul, Minnesota. And she is a DEAI consultant that we partner a lot with on projects. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who is going to introduce our panel, and then we'll take it from there.
All right, hello everybody. Nice to see a great audience. Oh, folks from Brooklyn, hello. Great to be here. Super happy to moderate a second panel with my partners at CFA with some wonderful experts here on boards. Today's conversation is about the challenge of board diversity. As you know, our boards are vested with our legal or by our legal and social systems with significant power and influence over their organizations. They hire and govern the CEO and provide and assess the overall direction and strategy of the organizations. They establish policy-based governance. They have a fiduciary duty to protect the organization's assets and the investments. They monitor and control the organization, and they're almost always responsible for raising a large amount of money, along which comes with that money some power. So today's conversation with our experts will explore what is needed to achieve and sustain board diversity and grow the power of Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC populations to influence the work and investments of charitable, religious, scientific, and educational institutions. So this is a proactive, BIPOC-centered look at how to address the board diversity issue. And we, as Paul said, we're not just here to analyze the problem, although we do hope to reveal some things, maybe some ahas for you or some surprises for you about the situations that we witness and how we think about those situations. But also we want to direct that conversation toward how we can fix it. So at the end of this, we have assembled a list of tips from our panelists, and that will be sent to you by Robert Coleman here from CFA after the event. A couple of assumptions I think it's important for you to know that we have about you, and that is that you are here to improve. You already understand that there is value in getting board diversity, so we're not here to motivate you to change. We assume you want to, so we're providing information in order to help you change. And our brand so far has been to be pretty forthright and have our panelists just be really straightforward and kind of unvarnished, give the unvarnished truth in a diplomatic and respectful way. But you may hear some things that, as my lovely associate I work with says, you might hear things that make you feel a certain way, a certain kind of way. And so please be prepared, be willing to hear it, be willing to validate what you're hearing, and be curious about it. And to the point of curiosity, please put any questions that you have in Q&A. We do have chat open, and that's fine too, but Q&A really helps us monitor what are the questions that we need to ask and make sure that, that we need to answer, and make sure that we do answer those. So we're going to have a little bit of an introduction from Paul about what he learned about board diversity as he was serving one of his clients. We'll have a little bit of a roundtable with our panelists, and we will then also respond to the Q&A. So I want to introduce our panelists before turning it back over to Paul. We have William Harris, who is the president and CEO of Space Center Houston, Texas. He's a returning panelist, his second visit with us, and he is celebrating 5 years in your position. I think I saw that on LinkedIn, right? Congratulations. We have Sammy Hoy, president of the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. And he is also on the board of United States Artists. Kim Nelson is retired Senior Vice President of External Relations for General Mills after almost 30 years. So that's a very big congratulations too. Congratulations on your retirement. However, of course, she's still doing a lot, right? So she serves on corporate boards as well as some nonprofits, including the Northside Achievement Zone in Minneapolis. And then Drew Wilson, he is the COO, CFO of SoundCloud, an online audio distribution platform and music sharing website based in Berlin, Germany. And he is a board member for the Gotham Film and Media Institute. So we will have conversation with them, but to kick us off, let's go back to Paul, who will share, who will launch this conversation.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, before we launch into the conversation, I just wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the genesis of this panel today. Very quickly, we were asked by one of our clients who's a newer nonprofit based on the East Coast, and they are at the point of their evolution that they need to build their board. They have a sort of functional board, but they really wanted to build their board. And they were very sensitive about the fact that they did this right, that they had one bite at the apple to sort of get this right from the beginning, and that they didn't want to have to like build a board and then have to make a bunch of changes, you know, down the road. So they wanted to start off on the right foot with doing this. And so they asked me if I could do some research into the best practices around how to really build a very strong and diverse board. And so I actually then engaged with Lisa, and Lisa and I did this together. And this is what I'm going to show you is a much condensed version of the findings that we presented to this client. And just a quick page of some of the discoveries in the research that we did. One is that this was really interesting to me that many of you are probably familiar with BoardSource, which is a really wonderful resource. But in 1994, BoardSource did a study and they found that 80% of members of nonprofit boards were Caucasian. And surprisingly, by 2017, this number had increased to 84%. What we found often is that staff and board are really aware of the importance of diversity and equity, and they really want to achieve greater diversity and equity on their boards, but they often lack the knowledge, skills, resources, or really genuine commitment to turn that awareness into actual action. We also found that organizations that place a really high priority on fundraising capacity and or the ability to give, especially those that specified a contribution requirement for the board, were also the most likely not to have policies in place to ensure board diversity. And I can talk about that later if you want, but that was a very interesting finding. Majority of organizations rely upon personal networks of board members to identify potential new board members. Board members go and look for people that look like themselves. And boards that have a really clear recruiting matrix are often more successful at building diverse boards. So I just wanted to do one more slide in terms of what we discovered in terms of why is a diverse board important. The first is that the composition of a board reflects organizational values. Living up to those values helps demonstrate institutional trustworthiness. A diverse board lends greater credibility to DEI values it develops. A wide range of perspectives in the boardroom is critical to effective corporate governance. Multiple views lead to decision-making that is more likely to take into account the risks, consequences, and implications of possible actions. But also those diverse perspectives really allow an organization to take into consideration all of their constituencies. A diverse board helps organizations navigate complex and dynamic social issues. And a diverse board can help an organization avoid missteps around issues requiring cultural sensitivity and to avoid blind spots. And finally, one of the things we gave to this client that they have found really helpful, and we can share this with the attendees at the end of this, is we created some values around guiding board recruitment. And those values were diversity. Each person brings a unique set of characteristics, experiences, and viewpoints. These can be important assets to the board and shall be treated as such. Inclusion, the board will be proactively ensure that its members share in all activities and privileges. Belonging, the board is stronger when its members act as a united whole. We will cultivate board relationships among board members and an affinity to the organization. Dialogue, we require a respectful and robust exchange of knowledge, ideas, and opinions so we can innovate and find the best solutions. Equity, the outcome of our efforts should not differ by race, ethnicity, gender, or other meaningful socioeconomic characteristics. No group should be disproportionately burdened or harmed. And finally, quality. Continuous improvement is the hallmark of excellence. And we will have routine processes to ensure that this is a priority. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and let Lisa turn it back to Lisa.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. That's a lot of powerful information. And so I'm going to launch the conversation based on that then. Sammy, the presence of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC people on boards has never been very high anyway, which we saw from the data that Paul showed us. But it's gotten worse, right? It's declined in the last 30 years. So meaning that essentially BIPOC groups have very little institutional power to influence how American nonprofit organizations are serving our own communities, much less other communities. So there's many reasons why that happens and that exists, but underlying those reasons are some assumptions and some philosophies about boards themselves and about BIPOC people. So in your estimation, what are two of those assumptions or philosophies that need to change if the organization wants to diversify its board?
Thank you, Lisa. We can count on you opening the dialogue with a punchy question. So thank you for asking that great question. I think Paul has covered some key points in his introductory remarks, but since you asked me to help identify two major assumptions of philosophies that need to change, I'll try to reframe and highlight a couple of the concepts that Paul mentioned. First, I think the barrier to board diversity is intrinsically linked to the structures that uphold traditional powers in our society and in dominant culture. Therefore, we have to mindfully and actively dismantle these structural obstacles in our minds, but also in our board policies and practices. Now, people who currently hold position of power tend to define power consistently with what they have and the privilege that they enjoy. So if people are in power right now are there because of money, they tend to define board seat worthiness as being able to have or to get money for the organizations. So to dismantle that, to me, I believe many people believe outdated thinking, we have to accept and codify that money is definitely an important contribution to boards, but it is not the only form of currency that we can think about board membership. We have to recognize the other resources that board members can bring in terms of the three T's that we all know about, talent, time, and treasures. So for example, like knowledge and expertise, connection and advocacy influence, community credibility, or just a really honest feedback voice from the community. These are just some other forms of power and currencies that are as critical as money to organizations and their boards. So a contemporary board will not want to forsake money. I'm not suggesting that at all as being important, but it should not allow that to be the primary dominant way to limit membership or to rank its members into pecking order. You have a bigger checkbook and write bigger checks, so you get to speak more. So a first barrier, I think, is the focus on monetary power as the primary board asset or filter. The second barrier I want to mention is the club culture that drives the development of many boards that's oftentimes associated with the first barrier. I believe that most boards and their members genuinely want to do good for the organizations and the causes. I think people have to be really, really, really evil to volunteer their time and resources to do harm. However, well-intentioned people do not always ensure good outcomes. It's human nature to have implicit bias, and such bias, as we've seen like through the international reckoning of social justice and racial justice, limits the potential of people and organizations, and fundamentally limits the impact that actually many organizations intend to have on societies. So oftentimes board members recruit from their limited circles, and they value those who think or behave or sometimes even look like as they do, because that's what they think is genuinely right or best for the organizations. But boards then inadvertently end up nurturing a club culture that reflects the people within that self-selected circle, rather than a microcosm of the society, of the communities that we say we serve, with members of diverse backgrounds and perspectives who can be rallied around the compelling mission and vision of the organization. I think that would be most powerful, coming together with a group of people instead of these are my friends, these are the people I feel comfortable hanging out with. I think in benign ways, such a club culture limits a board in ways that Paul has already outlined in his introductory remarks. But in less benign way, and sometimes I would even venture to say malignant ways, such a club culture actually allows more dictatorial or limited vision executives to control their boards, or for boards to exclude critical voices in the public and community that are really important to have to help the organization improve, but they just don't want to hear. So as a practice, I think there are ways to open up the board by creating matrices, by creating orientations to make everyone feel comfortable about that a board can remain socially comfortable, but have really can have strong and sometimes difficult conversations and different perspectives. I know that William for sure has done it with his organization. I have done it with mine, and we have also done it not just as CEOs or presidents, but really in partnership with other like-minded board leaders. So we can maybe later on, mention some of this as practical examples. I've gone on for too long, so let me wrap up by saying that broadly, I think power sharing is about defining and recognizing a broad range of power, and then creating room and conditions for everyone, every single person, to recognize their own power and to exercise their own power. And that can be applied to board building with very healthy results for organizations. I would actually say if we don't apply that to board building, we will not have healthy outcomes.
That's wonderful. And actually what you just said leads me to a great segue to a question to William. William, as Sammy pointed out, the board, as well as the officers and the executive director, all have power and influence on the organization and its ability to have a diverse board. So how do they work together or not? How can they reinforce each other, or even put up barriers to making that organization effective in having a diverse board?
Well, first I want to say Sammy nailed it in the head, and all of his points here were so excellent. And I agree 100% with what he said. And it really is a challenge, because this is work that's never done when you're working with your board. You have to constantly work at it. And it really boils down, most importantly, to the relationship between the CEO and the board chair. That they really have to work hand in glove. They have to both be committed to having a more inclusive board, but not only having people at the table, but actively participate. And it does mean that you have to listen to voices that may be disparate or different from what you're accustomed to, because we do have this proclivity as human beings to go toward people who are similar to us. And so how do we confront that homogeneity? And it takes being conscious. We have the ability to decide to make it different. So I think it's being very open with your board and clear communication around these are a set of expectations and values that we embrace, and this is how we're going to conduct ourselves. And so like anything, and especially in advancement, it's all about relationships. So how do you kind of convey the rules of those relationships? And you want to be clear about the values of the organization and what you're trying to advance culturally, from your entry-level staff and volunteers all the way up to your executive leadership. So you have to walk the talk in the organization, and you have to expect the same from the board. And so it means, and Sammy referenced this, having a matrix. You have to be very intentional in this work, and really have a candor and a way with the board that it's not hurtful or in any way pejorative, but to say we are not as representative as we need to be. And it's also looking at all the values that board members bring. Traditionally, boards have been looked to like a piggy bank, right? It's where you go. There can be a giving requirement every year. There are expectations around campaign support. And yes, they are the fiscal fiduciary agents of the organization. And you can put out those expectations about making the organization your top philanthropic priority. But you have to look at the other values and articulate what those are, because you do have to evaluate board performance. Are people meeting their expectations? And what are those expectations? I'm really a big advocate of for your board putting together either a code of ethics or a code of conduct that's a complement to your conflict of interest declaration. And that really kind of lays the ground rules for how you relate to one another, on the board. And it sounds like it should be obvious, something that you would know, but it's one way that you can help address unconscious bias by having that kind of code of conduct. So when someone is creating a conflict or is in violation of it, you can say to him or her, hey, I want to make you aware of what you said. Did you hear that? Do you understand how other people may have perceived that? So it's having that level of candor and trust. And to get there with your board, I'm also a really big advocate of the relationship building. You have to remember that often board members parachute in 3 to 4 times a year for a board meeting. They're not up to date in all the nuances and cultural and things going on when you have meetings. So what are you doing to proactively build relationships and engage those individuals, understand why they're involved, why are they passionate about your mission and what you're doing beyond what their assets are? So, and remember, this is a fundamental as well in advancement, that giving comes out of ownership. It's when people feel they have a stake in the success of the organization that they give assets, and they're willing to go to their circle and say, you've got to invest in this. This is really important. And so those are fundamentals in advancement, but they apply even more so than ever in creating inclusive boards.
That's wonderful, William. Just a little extra question you made me think of that I want to ask you, and that is, so oftentimes executive directors can be responsible for board recruitment. Usually the executive director, at least in my experience, the executive director might develop the plan for board recruitment and the timeline and the functions of that, and then the board just does what they're sort of told. What's a different experience that you have, and if not, then how might they work together better to really forward some of the items that you just said?
Well, I think that often boards are underutilized and board members and are under-engaged. I mean, these are people who don't have to be on your board. They're doing this as volunteers. They care about the mission of the organization. And so it really is incumbent on the executive director, CEO, and if he has to or she has to engage others to support this, to really get to know those individuals and to kind of lay out your priorities and expectations that they can help address. Because good board members should be saying to the staff, what can I do for you? What do you need? And hopefully they know you have an answer. You have a plan for every person that's on that board. I'll say in my practice, in my organization, we have a board governance committee, and I communicate at least twice a month with the chair of that committee. And we develop a matrix and a list of prospective board members. And I'm thinking about people from 2 to 3 years from now, because in the moment, I can't go cold to someone just because he or she has assets or appears to have an alignment with our mission and say, hey, we'd like you to be considered a board member. Well, your odds of success are pretty low if you do that. So what are you going to do to begin to get to know that person, they get to know you, and you really kind of get to see, are they a good candidate for leadership in your organization? And, I'll give you a great example. I had a board meeting earlier today, and we had 3 new board members. And we always have new board members talk about themselves a little bit and why they decided to join the board. And so, and it's really great because it's a self-declaration of their commitment, right? They're telling you why they joined the board. And it was so satisfying that they were espousing the values of the organization and why this was important to them and why they were so honored to be part of the board. So you really do want to have your board members have a level of humility for being involved, right? That this is something they view as an honor and a privilege, which it is to serve on the board of your organization. So I think that it's really important to have that kind of open dialogue communication, setting the expectations for service on the board.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Kim, you have experience in both nonprofit and corporate boards. And often, I don't know about if you are familiar with this, but there was a time that it was nonprofit boards were told often that they should act more like corporate boards, that they should treat not the nonprofit more like a business and approach it from that perspective. So, but both industries are talking about board diversity and inclusion. And so what are you seeing maybe in the corporate world that could help nonprofit leaders coming back around to that idea that maybe nonprofit boards could benefit from corporate work?
Sure. Well, and I bet they can benefit from each other.
Yes.
But thanks for the question, and thanks, Paul, for inviting me to be a part of the panel. A couple of things that I see in my corporate board experiences that I think are terrific best practices that any board should explore. Number one, on recruitment, William, you touched on it. It's the intentionality around what skills do we need for the future of our organization. And I think in the for-profit world, I think there's a lot of rigor in thinking about what matters for our organization, be it cybersecurity or ESG is very hot right now in the corporate sector, or DEI, inclusion and diversity, digitization. There are these certain skill areas that, you have a lot of older board members sometimes in their 70s that they just don't have. And by focusing on skills, I think it's helped the for-profit world be able to get deeper into organizations as they think of prospective board members. So I think that the skills matrix approach is really important versus, sometimes in my nonprofit experience, it's more just, as Sammy said, who do you know who has the resources to benefit our organization financially and fundraise? And that's, that ability to define assets that could be useful to an organization based on future needs as holistically as possible is really important when you start thinking about board diversity. And then the second piece on recruitment is requiring a diverse slate, just flat out, and not being hopeful that there will be some diverse perspectives, but just requiring that diversity on your board, these diverse views and perspectives. And if you have a skills matrix, you can get beyond the what do we want, meaning we want this diversity, to why do we want it? It's because we need this expertise to be brought to our organization. So that's one best practice. And then the other one I would cite is around inclusion. And I've just come on to 3 boards since 2019. So this is very fresh. So I've gone through onboarding with Cummins. Colgate was my most recent. I'm actually in the middle of that, and another organization, Tate and Lyle. And the best practice was doing very rigorous onboarding, one-on-one meetings with each board member. I've never seen that in nonprofit, as well as every key leadership team member. That is common best practice in the corporate world. I think a board chair check-in at the 3-month, 6-month, and 9-month mark. I've had that happen on my Cummins board, and it's really helpful. How are you feeling about the board experience? Do you feel like you're able to get your voice heard, and that sort of thing? And then the third piece is a robust board feedback mechanism that is quantitative, where there's a board survey that goes out, and specifically it has questions about equity on the board. Meaning, do you feel your voice is heard? Do you feel you have the opportunity to contribute? Is it an inclusive board environment? Those sorts of questions being included would also be another best practice around inclusion. Those are some thoughts. I'll leave it there.
That's great. And are you, give us a little insight, how well is the corporate sector doing with board diversity? They are making progress. I mean, there's been quite a bit of progress with women, white women, but slowly we're actually finally starting to see some progress
with people of color, primarily African American. It's not fast enough by any means, but it is beginning to happen. I mean, this has been, you know, and that's how it's always been, right? White women first, and that's okay. But this is the first time that you're really seeing things open up, and you're seeing organizations, companies are actually adding a board seat, because one of the problems is the turnover is so low in the corporate sector. And, you know, you literally have people who've been on boards for a really long time. But adding a seat is an option, you know, and even if that seat's just for a period to bridge to someone's retirement, which might be within 2 years' time, you know, that's a new strategy that we're seeing employed more and more. And a recognition that if your requirement is you want all CEOs on your board, which in itself makes no sense, why have only one perspective? But, you know, you're just excluding a lot of women and a lot of people of color. So I think that there is change, and I feel like corporate's making progress. Just needs to be a little faster.
Great. Yes. Everything needs to be faster. The progress. Thank you so much, Kim. Drew, the effort toward diversity inclusion, we just started, you know, Kim kind of alluded to this, that it tends to flow like the tide, right? It ebbs and it comes in a wave, sometimes a crashing tidal wave, but then it pulls back far. And so why do you think that's the case? And really, what can leaders do to sustain that sense of urgency that comes along at a time like this? But then, you know, other stuff comes up.
Well, thanks, Lisa. One of the things I'd start off saying is that what Sammy and William talked about sharing power is dead on. And it's not going to come easy, that's for sure. And it's going to be a fight to get control and for sharing of power. And look, from my perspective, since the pandemic has started and since the movement of the BLM and injustice, a lot of companies and organizations don't want to be on the wrong side of it. Now, the general, your employee set, your management, and your customers now require companies and organizations to take a side. You cannot be passive. And so my experience in both being an executive managing boards and being on boards is that I think we're going to see a different spike, as Kim has talked about now, since 2020 in these next couple of years, because nobody really wants to be seen on the right side of it. And I will particularly say that NGOs and nonprofits have a false sense of comfort because they're doing good. There's some good that they're doing in the mission of their organization. And that good seems to lull them into a sense of comfort that the representation within the organization does not necessarily have to be reflective because they are doing some good. And so the ebb and flow, I think, there's a moment that's happening over this period of the pandemic and the BLM movement that, and I would say the last piece of that in my mind that's changing this is the speed at which judgment and movements can occur because of social media. And so with all of those in case, no organization, for profit or non, wants to be on the wrong side of that. And so I suspect that we will see the ebb and flow turn favorably for some period of time. And I hate to say it, they're doing it in their best interest, their own self-interest, not because they've found some real reason. The real benefit of long-term improvement in board diversity and DEI, in my opinion, is coming from when, as they occur, the winning, when you can add board people to your organization and their experiences and perspectives actually improve the underlying performance of the organization they're serving, whether it's in fundraising or operational effectiveness, that will give others the permission and the comfort to share power. And that goes for nonprofits and for-profits. And so I hope we have turned the corner on this issue, at least on the acceptance of the idea, but we shall see. I know right now, people are just scared to be called out. And so people who are BIPOC are getting their phones, they're ringing quite heavily right now, and we'll take it. But there's a lot more ground to cover now.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think my little plug there is that I don't think you can sustain this kind of change unless you have those policies and practices and even the built environments, the technology or the space to support and put a structure around that change and make sure that it is institutionalized and sustained over time. And without having the individual CEO, the individual board member, the individual president be the one who's ensuring that the change happens, they're gone, and then it's back to business as usual. So it sounds like, William, maybe you have something to say about that. And then afterwards, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, who's going to get some questions from chat. Go ahead, Paul or William.
Thank you. I just wanted to add on, absolutely right. I think my mantra has always been, how do we make this part of the DNA of the organization so that it becomes a practice? Because it's got to live on beyond me or the commitment of a CEO in an organization. And so you really have to look comprehensively at the organization. And I love Kim's feedback in the corporate sector on those practices of the constant check-ins. So it's everything, not only from the policies, but also the procedures of the organization, the hiring practices. You're looking at, we have a multi-year strategy. So how is this going to be put into practice in the organization? And absolutely, and there is a lot of data that shows that a more inclusive, diverse organization is far more productive and profitable. I mean, that is a fact, that is known, but you have to prove that in your organization with your policies and practices and having a more inclusive organization. But again, you're not going to get results overnight. In the case of where I'm at currently, I mean, that was a mandate of the board when I was hired. And one reason I joined the organization, the board chair, who was an elderly Caucasian male, part of the power structure in Houston, said to me, I'm a dinosaur. You're the face of the future. We really have to change. So he was committed to it. And we work hand in glove. We're very different people, but we're committed to that higher goal of the organization. And we went from a very homogeneous board where I had one person who was diverse in the entire board of the organization when I started, to now we have 9. And we had 3 women out of 30 board members. We now have 10. So it's not going to happen overnight, but it's a process and you've got to be really committed to it over time. And the last thought I wanted to share was, because you have a homogeneous board, it doesn't mean they're bad people. I mean, these people care about your organization, so don't demonize them, but it's really getting them woke and committed to this work over a period of time. Because many boards have the same board members for a really long time. They may not have term limits, and there may be a family legacy because they're a founder of the organization. You have to take into account all of those factors, but if you're going to survive and move into the future, you have to really become an inclusive and a diverse organization.
Thank you, Paul. We have some questions. Do you want to?
We do have some questions. I first want to respond to a couple of things that people have said and just respond to it on some of the research we did. One of the things Kim said was about, literally requiring that the pool be diverse, like that this isn't a nice to have, but it's a need to have. And we do know some organizations that have applied what is sometimes referred to as the Mansfield Rule. Now it's sometimes referred to as the Rooney Rule. The Rooney Rule is actually used in the NFL, which actually requires that 30% of your prospect pool for your board be diverse populations. It's required. And so what that also requires is for an organization to be really intentional in how you are recruiting board members. Some organizations use headhunters. Some organizations advertise board positions on LinkedIn. Some organizations go far beyond their networks. They ask volunteers, they ask staff members, they ask community leaders who might be good board members. So the recruiting is much more robust than like, do you know a Black person who lives on your street that might be on this board? So a really good colleague and friend of mine always says that this work is like going to the gym. You're not going to go to the gym once and get in shape, right? You have to go to the gym over and over and over again in order to be better about this, right? The other thing, and this is a bit of a response to a question that's in the chat, but I want to open this up, but the question is, how do organizations prevent these changes from being performative? And I think that's a very good question. And it speaks a little bit to what we learned about the matrix, and that the matrix can't be that you check that box for an African American person, and you check that box for a Latinx person, whatever. That the board, the matrix, you have to check more than one box, right? That's a little bit of what Kim was saying, is that how the matrix can be so powerful is that it's not just about checking boxes. It's about actually, you know, doing the work to find the right people to fill the right functions. But, you know, so it goes beyond just checking boxes. But how do you guys think organizations prevent changes from being performative?
If I may chime in, I think one key goal, I think I completely agree with Kim and Paul, can making it requirement to be diverse, but it's also really committed to putting actually people of color into leadership positions. There's no two way about that. I think, you know, as long as the leaders remain primarily white, the culture will remain primarily white. So at my institution, which is very long, successful institution, my predecessor was legendary in what he has accomplished. But when I arrived, the entire senior administration was devoid of actually people power. 7 years in, we now have close to actually a POC majority. And also a stronger, you know, kind of gender balance as well on the board. Now we have actually a first African-American board member. The one of the vice chair is Southeast Asian. The person who is in charge of, actually chairs the Trustees Affairs Committee is also a person of color. So I think it's, as Lisa said, it cannot happen fast enough. It cannot be rushed because it has to be hand in glove, as you know, William said, the executive leadership and the board leadership, and not just the board chair and the president, but of the board membership really have to all embrace this as a, you know, mandate and going about it. But if we all are mindful and embrace the work together, it actually can move you know, pretty fast. But I don't think you can do it without actually the leadership itself evolving and changing at the same time.
Any other feedback about how this doesn't become performative?
I think it's unfortunately incumbent on, you know, usually 3 individuals, and that's most importantly is the chair of the board, and the seriousness with which that chairman seeks to put a group of leaders around the table that truly are going to bring diverse perspectives that will help the organization make better decisions. And because that chair is going to be the one that says, you know, let's look for, you know, more than, you don't want boards who are like, okay, we've got our woman and we've got our person of color, we're done. This is our person of color board seat. Here's our female board seat. You know, that's what we really don't want. And so I think the chair has a lot of influence on that. And I think the head of NomGov, if it is a board that has a NomGov committee, a lot of times that's the whole board, in which case every board member has a voice in this, by the way. That's very, very important, is this sense that every board member, no matter what your background is, can be pushing for this diverse perspectives around the table will make our organization better viewpoint. So I think those are, you know, first and foremost, the board chair, but secondly, the leader of NomGov can ensure that, you know, we're getting it right. And again, I keep coming back to the skills matrix, because the skills matrix to me is, it's the way you make sure that people are actually bringing something that the board needs.
Yeah.
I wanted to add actually on build onto what Kim was saying. And that is, when you start having more inclusion on your board, you have to really ensure that those people feel active and participatory in the organization. And a tactic that I've used for years that works really well are board retreats, and being sure that you have time away, you include a spouse or partner, that you make it half play, half work, and that it's very intentional around them getting to know each other, because you want to create open lines of communication and dialogue. And the best way to dispel kind of bias and prejudices through people getting to know each other and starting to recognize that they have many more commonalities than differences. And kind of the biggest commonality is the mission of the organization that they're serving on the board of. So really the CEO with the board chair really has to cultivate that group dynamic and that ability to have candor and speak with one another, and also familiarity. And I
Another
really
question.
worry when you recruit kind of diverse board members, sometimes they can feel, as Kim was saying, if you take it from you're checking off boxes, that they never really integrate into the organization and feel part of it or feel valued, and people deselect.
Another question from the group here. It's nice to say board members care, but the stats say they are still actively complicit in not increasing diversity. How do we break that pattern? Skills are a great way, but even how many boards define skills is antiquated and complicit in blocking change. Ooh, did we stump the panel?
Kim or Drew? Yeah,
Well,
Kim.
I actually thought Kim answered a little bit of this just in her last response, which was about the leadership of the chair. And so I like to tell people that innovation is not a for-profit idea. It is available to NGOs and nonprofits as well. And from that perspective, the chair of the board has to drive the priorities of the board, or at least what the focus of their efforts are. And from that, along with the executive of the company, and from that perspective, they are the ones who have to set the tone from the top on that, for sure.
I have another thought to add to the mix, which is something that I see happening in the business world that I think either could happen, and maybe it is happening, but in the business world, there are two sort of steamrollers coming at companies. One of them is the legislation that we're seeing in places like California requiring board diversity. So everyone's scrambling to get ahead of that. And then the second is the investor community has gotten very active in their statements to companies saying, look, we are not going to invest in companies that do not have diverse boards. And so both of those things are gaining momentum. Oh, the third is the requirement of reporting on board diversity. And I think Drew said it well, nobody wants to be called out. And the investment community is requiring that. So the equivalent in the nonprofit world is the funding community. And I think the funding community can make a huge difference here in ensuring that these moves aren't performative, and ensuring that, people get religion around bringing these diverse perspectives around the table, and they do it for the right reasons, not to check the box or to get their check written, but because it will make the organization better. You went through it, Paul, it'll help the organization better anticipate external forces that are going to shape the future of the organization.
I wanted to add on to that also civic now, because increasingly there are cities across the country who are beginning to adopt racial equity principles. That has happened in Cincinnati, and it's just happened in Houston, where in Houston, 140 companies now have signed on to racial equity principles. And the fallout from that too, or the consequence of that, is now those companies, when they look at their community involvement and charitable giving, have that same expectation of those charities that they support. So, there's now the civic is happening in different cities across the country as well, in terms of an expectation of equity and accessibility.
I have a question. And I'm going to actually riff off a little bit of a question that's in the chat. And the question is, those organizations that serve a, say, majority Black and brown and people of color population, but their boards are primarily white, right? So how is that reconciled? And really my question is, from your perspective, why is that a problem? I know that seems like an obvious question, but I think a lot of board members don't understand why that's a problem. Let's start with Drew.
Thank you, Paul, for that grenade. Well, self-awareness is not something that is very common in the boardroom of most corporations as it relates to the homogeneous nature of the skill sets they tend to have. There's a newness that's coming around on that side. So most of my experience is on the corporate side, but I would say it's lack of awareness and self-awareness, I should say. And so once again, I believe from what I've experienced, where I'm on the board where there was no diversity until I recently joined, their motivation was fear. The fear of being identified as not having any sense of the times or the sense of the benefits of having diversity, the sense of the constituency they're trying to serve, which is diverse. And so fear drove them into that action. And I like what Kim said, that you don't want to be in the token seat or the only woman seat. You don't want to be in those seats. You want to be in the seats at a board level that are there because of your experiences and skill sets that are accretive to the organization. So I think fear is what's driving a few people today. I say what we have to hope for is that the value of the diversity that improves the board's effectiveness becomes the #1 motivator to expand DEI at a board level.
Anyone else about that issue of sort of whiteboard serving a mostly people of color population and that issue?
Yeah, I think the other thing is, Sammy talked about currency earlier in his opening thoughts. And one type of currency that can be very valuable for nonprofit boards is networks. And people of color often, and women, have different networks. I mean, that's part of why they rarely make it onto the board, because their networks are almost, the Venn diagram is very, that overlapping piece tends to be more narrow, but that's a huge opportunity. These are networks sometimes in community, for an all-white board serving a diverse community, having better entree into that community for insight, for partnership, for other organizations that are more of that community can be very valuable for programmatic effectiveness, for understanding the actual equity of the organization in that community being served. So I think there's tremendous value there to be tapped.
Okay, any other thoughts on that subject?
I would just say that the conversation about all white boards and governing organizations that are serving primarily populations of color is that I think you have to recognize that. I think it was William said, they're there because they care, and that's a good thing. And I think it's a little dangerous to how do I want to say this? To forget or to minimize the contributions that they have made and can make. And you still need to recognize they don't have all of the information, the networks, the relationships, the understanding that they need to have to very effectively serve their clients and customers and communities. And so I think it's incumbent then on those boards to add the seats at minimum, right? To begin to move towards diversity immediately. And one of the strategies can be to add seats. And in fact, I've coached a number of my clients, add seats to your board. Don't wait for a vacancy to come up. And don't think that fulfilling 1 or 2 seats that are coming vacant are going to do it for you. That's not going to create the kind of environment on the board that you need to have that will be safe and welcoming for people of color to be on that board and to not feel tokenized in any way, at least as much as they probably would be if there were only 1 or 2 seats. So I'm often coaching my organizations to make sure there's at least 3 new people of color on their board all together as a cohort, ideally 4 at once. So I think it's really, again, important that organizations start and they do it in they move to a tipping point as quickly as possible.
If I may add
Um,
just quickly,
Yeah,
one
Sammy,
thing.
go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think, since Lisa warned early on that our audience may not like what you're hearing, but be open-minded to it, I'll be slightly impolite in saying what I was going to say next. I think all white board serving a primarily non-white population or communities, I would say it's actually failing its fiduciary duty in some ways, because the board is about positioning your organization and its purpose and its resources and its purpose for the future, and also to get the maximum resources coming to the board. By having an all-white board nowadays in today's contemporary society, one, you're not going to position yourself to be attractive to the most gifted and talented next CEO coming to it, because I don't think any POC leaders or leaders that would actually have that kind of spiritual, maybe not a POC or a background with the community will want to come to work with a board like the current board. Two, I think, as Kim says, the giving communities are kind of like the investors for the kind of corporate boards. Foundations will not be interested in actually investing in continue investing in organizations that the board is not diverse. So if there's a basically board that's open-minded, good-spirited, and everything, I think this is exactly as Lisa has said. I think this is the a proactive time to really kind of move into true diversity. The other thing I want to mention is that don't. I think we've all said in different ways. Avoid tokenism at all costs. In my organization, we have a board that was somewhat diverse, but increasingly diverse over time. And what's the beauty about it is that we are mindful about the identification of potential candidates, the onboarding, as Kim has outlined. But once the board members have come on the board, the background, the diversity, not just racial, ethnic, but also is never in the forefront. I think what's in the forefront is really what the perspective and the currency that we talked about that they bring that actually enriches the board in a very concrete way. I think that's the most authentic way for also board members to feel ownership and wanting to invest even more. So diversity is it's a necessary lens and a filter in, but should never be the identifier or the signifier of the value of the person once they are in, because I think that's about like sharing power.
Absolutely lovely. That's a great way to end. Fabulous last words. Thank you, panelists. I learned a lot, and I'm very excited to have met all of you and hope to continue our conversations in other ways. Paul, back to you.
Thank you, everybody. Well, thank you so much for attending.